Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our final lunchtime talk of 2019. Just a quick announcement, and actually I have to do this myself. Please silence or turn off your cell phones and electronic devices. We want to take a minute here to thank our sponsors, the Nancy Carroll Draper Charitable Foundation, as well as Sage Creek Ranch, who make all of our lunchtime and after dark presentations possible. We're thrilled to host a growing pool of engaging and dynamic speakers, many of which have carved out livelihoods through work and research here in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Our capacity to continue attracting these high-quality speakers has only been made possible through the generous support of our sponsors, for which we are increasingly grateful. These lectures are being recorded and are uploaded to YouTube, so if you've missed any of our previous lectures for this year or for last year, you can go to youtube.com, search Draper Natural History Museum, and you'll find those presentations there. If you'd like to be added to our listserv, please flag me down either before talk or anytime after talk. Also, if you've previously written your name on a list but you have not received emails, it's probably because I couldn't read your handwriting. So flag me down again, let's get that email down here, and you will receive those notifications. We've also started including links to previous talks in our emails. So another reason to sign up is if you've missed a previous talk and we send you an announcement for an upcoming talk, you'll see links to those earlier ones on that email. We're going to break from the holidays, resume our 2020 lecture series in February 6th, where we'll hear, with presentations and announcements from Draper Natural History Museum curator Nathan Dorr. So today, we're going to hear from Mr. Tony Mong. Tony is a career wildlife biologist with the Cody District of the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. He received his Bachelor's of Science in Fisheries and Wildlife Science in 2001 from the University of Missouri and a Master's of Science in Wildlife Ecology from Kansas State University in 2005, where he studied resource selection and response of upland sandpipers to fire management activities in prairie ecosystems. And if you guys have never heard the call of an upland sandpiper, it is super cool. So definitely go and Google this afterwards. Mong also spent 5 years as a research and project manager overseeing all activities associated with demographic, survival, and harvest rates of mourning doves. Mong has since worked with a variety of species and landscapes. In 2010, Mong began his career with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department working as a senior wildlife biologist in bags, where he acquired extensive experience and expertise working with some of Wyoming's most iconic migratory species. His research, which he has funded through successful grant proposals, includes monitoring the response of elk to beetle kill, analyzing pronghorn movement and survival in relation to human occupancy on and use of the landscape, and sex-based differences in mule deer migration. Mong also uses remote-operated cameras to assess body conditions of mule deer and leverages a wide variety of tools to ask and answer questions necessary for managing Wyoming's wildlife. I first met Tony in 2017, where we co-taught a migration course with Science Kids Cody here inside the Draper Natural History Museum. Today, I'm honored to host Tony as our final lunchtime expedition speaker of 2019. Please give Tony a warm welcome.
Well, thank you very much. I love coming to a talk where they clap first because that means that I don't need to do anything else. I've done my job. You've clapped once, so that's great. Thank you, Corey, and a big thanks to the Draper Museum for inviting me here. First, I've got to start just by saying that, I am a biologist. I don't think outside of the biologist realm, so when I was asked to give this talk, I was kind of thinking along the lines of a talk entitled Lines on the Paper. But after, talking with folks that are smarter than me and our Tara and our information education, she's like, I don't know if that's gonna cut it. So we came up with something a little bit different. We're going to be talking today a lot about these 4 species here, Bighorn sheep, mountain goats, mule deer, and elk, and how they're using the landscape. But before I even do that, I've got to stop and thank a lot of people because I've only been in Cody for about 3 years now. And so a lot of the data that I'm going to be showing with you and sharing with you comes from other people. My predecessor, Doug McWhorter, who was here for a long time, put a lot of this information together. Folks out of the University of Montana, Yellowstone National Park, University of Wyoming, the list goes on. So I'm standing on the backs of giants presenting their data. So I want to definitely acknowledge them before we get much farther along. So when I was first asked about bringing a presentation, my thought immediately, and it was last December, I believe, that I was asked to give this talk. I started thinking about what is unique about Cody and Cody wildlife. And one of the most unique things that I've found here is that wildlife are very abundant and very easily seen during the winter, right? We have lots of animals in the fields. We have lots of animals on the roads, sometimes to their detriment and to our car's detriment. But what's unique is that they come here and then they leave. And a lot of times we have no idea where they're going, what they do when they're gone. And so that was kind of the premise, is that we really have this unique situation where we've got wildlife living in our backyards for a small portion of the year. Now this is great, and it makes us feel good, but what it can do is kind of desensitize us to the importance and the amazing effort that these animals make every year to come and live in your backyards. And so what I wanted to do today was just give you kind of a 100,000-foot overview of what it looks like once they leave here, and start to talk a little bit about making sure that we give these wildlife the respect that they deserve because of what they go through. I've started to make the case that Cody wildlife is some of the toughest wildlife, I believe, in the West for the conditions, the challenges that they face year to year. So that's what we're going to be kind of looking at today. Now, as a biologist, data really drives everything that we do. I get a lot of questions about, well, aren't you just a game warden? And I try to explain this to people is that, well, game wardens write you tickets, and I write reports. And so when you're writing a report, you need lots of data. You need things to back up what you're going to be saying. And so as a biologist for Game and Fish and other biologists and other agencies, we're constantly collecting data, whether it's swabbing for diseases, checking animals in for harvest, looking at different sizes of animals, doing radiotelemetry type research, looking at weights of fawns, you name it, flying in helicopters, counting elk. We collect all kinds of information and data. And that's the good part, right? We collect the data. But once you collect data, you've got to do something with it. And so that's where our computers come in. This would be a representation of me sitting down to start to analyze data. And then this is kind of me at about midway to the end of analyzing data. And so it's a double-edged sword. When you collect information, you've got to do something with it. One of probably the coolest pieces of information that or pieces of data that we get to collect involves capturing animals. And that is putting collars on animals and getting animals in hand. And that's where you get these pretty pictures, and that's where you get to actually interact in a personal way with the animals that you're researching. I will have to say, I don't know if you've seen the picture that we put out for advertisement. I was kind of taken aback yesterday when somebody came up to me and they said, "Man, I saw that picture. I thought you were shooting it with a pistol." I was like, why would we be shooting elk with a pistol? She didn't have a reply to that, but I was a little taken aback. So if you saw that picture, I'm not shooting the elk with a pistol. If you thought so, we were releasing the elk in that actual picture. So this allows us to get close to the animals, and a lot of times we just think about the end result, which is putting these collars on and getting that information. But when we have animals in hand, there's a lot of other information that we're taking. And you know, the biggest thing that we see nowadays is the movement information that's out there. But in addition to that, we also get an opportunity to look at pregnancy rates. We also get to look at body fat. body condition in a very real way with using ultrasounds. And so once we have the animals in hand, we can collect a lot of great information. And in addition to that, the movement information that we're collecting, once we put collars on animals, we can start to understand not only how they're using the landscape, but how they're surviving out in the wild. And with that information, then we can start to build a better picture of the populations that we're managing. And that's really what it comes down to. As a biologist, as a manager, I want the best information possible to be able to manage these species in a way that allows them to continue on into the future. So that's great. I love these pictures where the animals are already in hand, but in order to get here, we have to actually catch the animals. And that can get a little difficult. And so over the years, wildlife biologists and others have come up with many different methods for catching these animals. Down in bags, I used a lot of drop nets to catch mule deer. These methods that I'll talk about first are methods where you actually draw the animal into an area using some type of bait. And so usually a bait and a net are used. You bring the animals in and capture them that way. Corral traps are commonly used for elk. And even with our mountain goat study that I'll talk about, there was some use of some traps using salt to try to draw them into these traps where the doors actually drop once they go in, and then you're able to work the animal up. So that's one method. And another method demonstrated here by Doug McWhorter. If you've ever been up the North Fork, these bighorn sheep let you get kind of close, and that allows us to dart them right from the truck. So if you see us up there working sheep, it's usually after we've darted them. So they're pretty used to that. They're used to vehicles. We can drive up, get close enough, administer a dart that puts the animal to sleep, and then we can work the animal up safely. But I'd say the number one way that we catch animals in Wyoming is using helicopters. Now, as a guy, as an adventure seeker, as somebody who likes adrenaline, this is one of the greatest things that I could ever do, but I don't get to do it because it's too dangerous. They won't let Game and Fish employees actually do the captures. In most cases, we are actually hiring out companies. One of the companies we use around here, you may have seen this blue helicopter around, is a company out of New Zealand, actually. They bring a crew in. They do some amazing acrobatic flying, put the net over top of an animal. Animal gets tangled up, and then they're able to work the animal up. And that's kind of a first-hand view that I'll probably never get, and that my wife's pretty happy that I don't get to get that view either. I don't know if any of you have been to the captures that we've done in the past, but I wanted to give you a little bit of sense of what that looks like. Now, in some cases, we'll hire the company. They'll catch the animal, put the collar on, and let them go. But in a lot of cases, they'll bring the animal back so we can collect that information. We can collect blood. We can look at pregnancy rates. We can look at diseases such as brucellosis, and we can grab those samples. So that's what you're going to see here. You're going to see this helicopter bringing in an elk for a recent elk study that we just started. Well, maybe. So notice the skill of the pilot being able to drop that elk very gently onto the ground. And that allows us to come and start working that animal up in a very safe way. And that's what you see here. Once we have the animal in hand, then we can collect all the information we need to, as well as provide and attach the collar and allow that animal to be released. Now, once we attach a collar, we have this collar on there. And there's I wanted to make sure that everybody understands where this data comes from. And there's really three components to these radio collars. Now there's an old school collar, which just has a radio transmitter, emits a signal. Back in the day, we had to go out on the ground. We had to go and find these animals. Once we found them, we'd take our map out, we'd mark a location, and then we'd go on. And that system involves this collar, which is kind of like a radio station. And we have the equipment, the antenna, and the receiver that allows us to pick up that radio station. Each animal has its own individual radio station, so we can keep track of individual animals. Now that's the old style that we used to use, but now we've come in with some new technology, and we use a lot of GPS and satellite technology today. And the way that works is that you've got satellite receivers up in the air, and we have hundreds of these now, and they're flying around. The collar initiates a location, talks to the different satellites. The satellites all coordinate, triangulate onto this animal, and put a point onto the ground, or a point on the ground where that animal is. Then, depending on the collar type, the data is either then distributed out into a server that allows us to look at that data in real time, or it's dropped back onto the collar, and we have to go out and pick up the collar and get the data off of it. We're going more and more to the system that keeps me in the office more, which is not great, because now, our upper, administration's all excited about us just being able to pull data off the internet, but it, again, keeps me at the computer a little bit more than I'd like. But some amazing technology. Battery technology is also increased. That's a limiting factor on the number of locations that we can get per animal. But today, because of battery technology, we can get upwards of 24 locations a day for a year or more, so one every hour. We did a study in bags where I was able to change that, and during a certain time of the year, I was getting locations every 30 to 45 minutes for that time period. So it's a pretty amazing technology that we have. With that said, though, what happens then is that we have a ton of data. Just for this is Cody, covered in all the most recent data from 2010 until current for all the species that we've talked about. It was about 1.7 million points I ended up with when I started putting this presentation together. And because of that, I think my computer has aged about 20 years because of all the data I was kind of crunching through it. For this presentation, we'll be looking at 359 different individuals between those 4 different species. And I wish it just came in a package. You put it in the computer, and it was great. You didn't have to do anything with it. But unfortunately, you get kind of some outliers. You get some problems. Sometimes the locations aren't that great. Sometimes an animal dies, and you pick up the collar, and you take it to your house, and you forget to turn the collar off, and people start to wonder who poached an animal. I don't know. That's not personal experience, I promise. But so you've got to clean up the data. So there's a lot of kind of front-end work before you can really get into looking at that information. So that's what we start with. This is what I started with for kind of looking at this talk. As you can see, it's kind of a jumbled mess if you put it all together. So we're going to break it down by species. We're going to look at the different species that we're going to be looking at, and then we're going to look at just several aspects to each of those species. One thing with this up here, in most cases, especially with our mule deer and elk, we're looking at different use ranges. So typically on the eastern edge of Cody is where we're going to have our winter range activity. So typically, and we'll see this in some of the data, they'll show up anywhere from beginning in late September through December and even January for some of our elk. And they'll show up down here on the east. Summer range occurs on the western front. Over here, a lot of our animals are Yellowstone park animals. They spend their summers there. And there's not a ton of activity that happens in the middle here, especially with our mule deer and elk. We definitely get more mountain goat and sheep use in the middle, in between, But for mule deer and elk, there's just not a lot of use in between those two ranges. So we're going to focus on mountain goats, bighorn sheep, mule deer, and elk today. For each of those species, I'm going to again give you the kind of 100,000-foot view. We're going to talk a little bit about the populations of each, how they're doing, and a little bit of survival information that we are getting from the collars. And then we are going to look at some general movement patterns. And then there's a few specific movements that I want to show you and want to kind of point out to you for each of these species. So we're going to start with our introduced species. If you didn't know, mountain goats were introduced just north of the line there, kind of at Line Creek, and over by Silvertip, over in that country. And have since moved south and as well as east. We have basically two different herds that we look at. We look at the Beartooth herd, which occurs in the Beartooth area. And then we've got our Absaroka herd, which occurs to the west of the Clarks Fork River. Now, to manage this population, we use a mix of trend count flights. Every other year we go up, we fly these areas. As you can see kind of behind the photo there, or behind the words, we fly these areas and try to count goats that we're finding. We use helicopters for those surveys. We'd like to see between the two herds about 150 total mountain goats. Last time we counted, which was 2018, we counted about 229. Not evenly distributed. The Beartooth herd seems to be doing not as well as the Absaroka herd, so we're counting more in the Absaroka than we are in the Beartooth. And I didn't have a lot of data slides up here, but I did want to show you kind of where we flew in 2018. If funds were unlimited, we'd fly a lot more, but unfortunately, we haven't found that unlimited pot. If you'd like to fund flights, let me know. I'll be here afterwards. But from that flight, we then average the number of animals that we see over the previous 3 years of surveys, and we end up with data like this. And so on the left, you've got our Hunt Area 1, or the Beartooth herd, and the years on the bottom, and then the 3-year average number of goats. And you can see that there's definitely a decline. Some of that is hunter-induced. We did want to manage for fewer goats in this area, and so you see some of that happening. But we feel like there's a little bit something else going on there too that we're going to be looking at. Now over in Hunt Area 3 in the Absaroka herd, again west of Clarks Fork River, we've actually been seeing quite a bit of increase over the last several years. And that's a little bit concerning. I want you to keep that in mind as we move forward and start to talk about where these animals are living and think about how animals interact as well. For goats, survival is typically, if you're looking at annual survival, year to year, anywhere from 80 to 85, 88%. And it's variable based on the season. And goats are interesting because they actually have a higher survival in winter. And you don't see that with any of our other ungulate species. And they're made for winter. And so when winter comes, they go to the highest places where nothing else is going to go. And they lay down, and they're happy doing that. And so their highest survival is actually during the winter. Now, for mountain goats, we've got about 46,000 points. This is our least amount of data. Mountain goats are tough to catch. They spend a lot of time in the wilderness, and there are restrictions on animal capture in the wilderness that we have to work with the Forest Service on, and they're hard to capture. So it's kind of our lowest number of individuals and our lowest number of points. But this is kind of what it looks like. This is done from a study, a mountain ungulate study that looked at interactions between mountain goats and bighorn sheep. and this is what we have in our area as well as in Yellowstone. What I want you to note is look at kind of the patterns of these points. Pretty constricted, kind of living in one area. There's not a lot of big movements for these guys. I think, if you look on average between the 22 individuals, they move about 400 miles in the lifetime of their collars, but they really kind of pack in here tight. Once you release them, they don't go very far. There might be some migration across drainages, maybe from north slope to south slope, but there's not a lot of long distance migrants. So I guess, the average distance traveled is about 334 miles. That's generally over a 2-year lifespan of these collars. And so then you end up with some nice lines, but for these guys, there's not much there. They don't do many big movements. There's a couple of cross-state boundary movements. There's a couple of movements out of the park, and especially down here. Our longest mover was actually down here. We'll take a look at him. He was collared as a 2-year-old male, and that makes sense. Young males are going to typically move more than any of the other sexes or ages, because they're trying to find their place in the world. And so he was doing a lot of moving back and forth. Over his lifespan from, I think about a year and a half to 2 years, he moved about 474 miles. Just to orient you, this is Sunlight Peak, and then this is the North Fork coming up to Sunlight Peak. So he was all over this country here, and spending a lot of time up on the high ridges. This isn't him. That'd be great if I could get a picture of him. But note the extra hardware we give these animals. Once we capture them during a capture event, they'll put those on the horns so that they don't recapture individuals on accident, and so that they can see them from the air pretty easily. So 474 miles, a pretty good mover as it relates to mountain goats. I like these Google Earth shots because it gives you a better idea of the terrain that they're actually covering. You can see here, this is Sunlight Peak right here, and so he's running up and down these different ridges, running the ridge lines up and down. I will never be able to follow this guy's track. I know we're seeing all these new movies coming out where people are following migration routes of this or that. I don't know that you'll ever see one for a mountain goat. I don't know if that'll happen. I think I would quit pretty quickly. So that's our mountain goat kind of information that I wanted to share with you, just kind of give you an idea. Let's move on to bighorn sheep. Now, bighorn sheep have always been here, and we have what we call a core native herd, and it's actually the largest herd in the lower 48 of North America. Currently, we're running about 3,500 sheep in the herd. The herd stretches all the way, though, from the Montana boundary all the way down almost to Du Bois, so it's a pretty large area. Now, with these guys, we use, again, a mix of harvest data as well as some classification and survival data to manage these. A lot of our management, though, is heavily based on our harvest statistics because we just can't get a big enough sample size to give us a lot of confidence in the estimate that we're coming up with for these sheep. And so these sheep numbers are down. If you've been out and about, been hunting, we have seen a decrease in our sheep. We've been running kind of under where we'd like them to be. We'd like them more around the 4,500. And again, take this estimate with a grain of salt. There's a lot of kind of small sample size information that goes into this, but we feel like we are below where we like to be. Now, annual survival for bighorn sheep is similar to mountain goats, around 84%, with some variation around that. But opposite of our mountain goats, their best survival is in summer, and that's typically what we'll see and a really high survival of 97%. That's when you'll see these guys move up into these areas that are big and open, high, nothing can reach them, and so they're able to survive that way. However, with bighorn sheep, we're always concerned about populations. And we've had, within the Absaroka herd, mainly on the southern end, we've had big die-offs of bighorn sheep because of diseases, and mainly because of pneumonia diseases. So I ask everybody that I talk to, if you're up the North Fork, South Fork, you see sheep down and you see a sheep coughing or having a lot of snotty discharge, get a hold of us at the office, let us know so I can go check on that animal. It is something that we want to try to keep out of the herd as much as possible. The other thing that we've been seeing over the last couple years is scabies, which is a mite that basically eats all the hair off their back and can make it can spread through the entire population. So those sheep, unfortunately, they like to die easily. So we're always we have very light gloves whenever we manage sheep. One thing that I'll note with our movement data is that we don't the picture is not complete. We have a lot of high elevation wintering sheep, and it's just hard to get to them to get collars on. So the data that you're going to see that we have is from sheep that are a little bit more accessible. So as we look here, we had a little over 226,000 points from 81 individuals over the last 4 to 5 years here. And a lot of movement here, but you see some holes and where there is probably sheep. But again, our ability to get to those sheep is decreased because of where they're living. So some of the future research that we're going to be looking at is how do we fill in these gaps and how do we understand what our high elevation sheep are doing? Because we can collar these sheep along the North Fork all day long, right? But it's the sheep that live up high that are a little bit more difficult. So the average distance traveled over the collar life is about 582 miles. And what you're going to see here from mountain goats to elk is a progression of length of movements. Here you can see that we're getting into a little bit different movement patterns. They're not staying on the same ridge. They are doing some movements, some migration type of activities from one range to another. And you're starting to get a little bit more of what we'd consider like the artery type of migration. Not nearly as long as some of our other species, but much different than you would see with mountain goats. And one of the areas that I want to kind of draw your attention to is up on the Montana border here, up with the northern part of our herd. Pretty amazing movement. This actually represents 5 sheep that were collared on winter range over here, and they summer over here. They take a big trek up and around. So let's look just a little bit closer at that. So the migration path that goes around here is about 26 miles. Now that doesn't take into account the ups and downs, and I'll get to that in just a second. That's just flat land, 26 miles. And they typically are spending about 10 days to travel between the summer range, or the winter range and the summer range over here. This particular female that I pulled out has 27 months worth of data, and it over that time traveled about 881 miles. And again, that's straight land miles, okay? What we see when we start to pull out the elevational changes that these sheep are making on a daily basis, with this one short run, one run across here, you change going up and down 30,000 feet. It's amazing to me that these guys are making that. Google Earth allows you to look at kind of average slope, and for this particular gal here, her average slope that she was living on or staying on was about 38%. So those are steep slopes that they're living on, and they're going up and down throughout that time. So keep this one in mind too. We're going to come back to this example, and again, there were 5 animals that were actually making that trek, that exact line right through here. So this also presents some management challenges as we have no management authority up here. And they are moving through here when there are hunting seasons going on. So there's definitely, we've got to be talking with Montana on management of those sheep. Now, if we move south, I wanted to kind of point out one of the sheep that, lives on the road here. What are they doing? Because you see them there. You can drive up to them. You can get pictures of them pretty easy. And then they disappear. And it's kind of, where do they go? So I picked out one of the sheep that lives here during the winter, usually October to May. And look at the movement that she makes. My initial thought was, well, they're probably just kind of popping up here and hanging out in the ridges up above. But she goes 21 miles to the park boundary and travels some pretty amazing country. She takes about 10 days to travel this from summer range to winter range. In 25 months of data collected, she moved about 819 miles, which is pretty impressive. Now, again, elevation is key. So we got 21 miles here if it's just straight land. But if you put in what is called an elevational graph, so starting over here, this is where she winters, down on the road. These are all the different peaks that she crosses, the highest being almost 12,000 that she goes across. So once you do that, your distance actually increases to 28 for one way. And her elevational gain and loss, about 22,000 feet. And that's just one way. That's one way. And one thing to start thinking about when we think about these migrations and these different movements is that when they leave winter range, where are they going? They're going to summer range. What do they usually do on summer range as a ewe? They've got something inside of them, right? Now, I've never been pregnant, but my wife has been 3 times, and it didn't seem to be very pleasant towards the end. So I can't imagine making this trek when you're carrying offspring. And so keep that in mind too. As they leave winter range, a lot of these females are preparing to give birth, and they've got to travel all this country. And this is kind of what it looks like on Google Earth. She lives down here on the road, and then hops up on the ridge. This is the Elks Fork. She comes and she crosses the Elks Fork, goes up and over, and back down, and just keeps crossing these giant drainages, and then comes up a ridge and ends up summering again up by the park there. Just amazing movements, and something you don't think of when you see and you're taking pictures of these animals on the side of the road. So, I told you to remember that the earlier movement with the Bighorn sheep. We have 5 sheep that are moving back and forth. The black triangles represent Bighorn sheep. The yellow dots indicate mountain goats. So what we see here is we start to see some big overlaps in both summer and winter range for our Bighorn sheep with mountain goats. Now, part of the data that I'm presenting here was a study to look exactly at that. What are the potentials for having bad things happen with these? And so a recent publication out of Ecological Applications by Blake Lowry and a group out of University of Montana talked about that niche, or what they use, similarities among introduced and native mountain ungulate populations. And what they determined was that there is a potential for mountain goats to disturb or displace bighorn sheep throughout this range. And so it's a delicate management situation, because I know that people like mountain goats. Mountain goats were introduced, though. And so our job as wildlife managers is to take this data and understand what's going on in those interactions. And so with this collar data, we're able to get this type of information. Now, let's move quickly through some mule deer and some elk here. Mule deer, we'll be talking about 2 different herds. the Clarks Fork population and the Upper Shoshone, which is everything North Fork and South Fork, basically. We use classification information where we're going out counting does and fawns and bucks. We use harvest information. We use our survival information to estimate population size. And then we compare that population size to where we believe that populations can be held at. And currently within the Clarks Fork and the Upper Shoshone, we're down on mule deer. And so we'd like to see 4,000 to 6,000 in Clarks Fork. We're probably more around 3,000. In the Upper Shoshone, we'd like to see 9,000 to 14,000. And we're currently at probably about 8,000 to 8,500, 8,600, somewhere around there. There's a variety of things that are going on there. If you want to talk mule deer, let's talk afterwards, and we'll talk for hours more, because that's a whole different subject for sure. But this is kind of what it looks like over the last several years. Numbers have been kind of low. Starting about 2013, 14, we started to see a series of pretty bad winters here, as many of you have lived through them. And so we've started to see that population decline a little. Annual survival based on our collar data is about 80 to 85%, which is rather low for mule deer. If you look in other parts of the state, we typically use a survival rate of about 90 to 93% on adult females, but that's just not the case here. And obviously have better survival in the summer. We see a lot of the population being driven by the fact that we have low fawn productivity. And again, that's not the topic today, so if you want to talk more about that, we sure can. All right, we've got 75 individuals that we have collared from 2016 to 2018, and about 200,000 points at this juncture. What you can see, again, is that you start to stretch these out a little bit more. They start to look more like these arteries, these different types of migration paths, right? And we see it here. What's one of the interesting things that I've found over while putting this talk together is that the average distance traveled over the collar life for the Clarks Fork and the Upper Shoshone are quite a bit different. And I'm interested to explore that a little bit more. But over the lifespan of the Clarks Fork, about 704 miles versus 582 miles for the Upper Shoshone. I think a lot of that might have to do with summer range quality. Once they get to summer range, they may not have to move as much down here. Maybe the food quality is better. So they're not spending as much time walking around looking for food, whereas they are up here. So anyways, that's more information to come. And as is with most research projects, you go to answer a question and you just come up with more, right? And that's what happened here. All right, so I wanted to focus on a couple of really kind of longer distance movements from our mule deer. Clarks Fork, this deer starts off on winter range just north of Hart Mountain, goes all the way up the Clarks Fork Canyon, or kind of cuts across, gets into the canyon here, and actually ends up summering up by Silvertip up there. So, and then down here, this is a deer that lives in one of our employees' yards, I believe, and she looks forward to seeing her every year, and I thought I'd share that one with you. So we're going to look at those two. This is the Clarks Fork one, or Silver Gate. I was saying Tip, sorry. Silver Gate in Cook City, and this is where that deer summers, is up in this country here. But she makes that long trek all along the base here. But look down here when she starts she goes straight up and over and up and over. You can see it way out here. Pretty amazing, about 51 miles straight line. And this is what her elevational gradient looks like. I think we're looking winter range over here and summer range over here. But that adds another 6 miles to her trek, and her elevation gain and loss is about 20,000 feet. Again, when she leaves winter range, she's heavy with fawn and doing that every year in and year out. And it's tough on them. I have numerous, many trail camera pictures showing that these animals are coming to the top of the ridge with their mouths open, breathing hard. It's not like it's an easy thing for them to do. And they're doing this consistently every year. You see a fawn here in the background. It's pretty amazing to go through these trail camera pictures and see what these animals are going through to get to and from the ranges that they need. Now, that second one, this is the South Fork River right here. This is Issawa, and then Lapella. And this deer is taking a route that is pretty common for deer. We've seen this quite a bit. She comes up here, drops into Pass Creek, and then drops into the thoroughfare. I'm going to come back to the thoroughfare in a minute, but they knew what they were doing when they named it. There's a ton of animals that use it. And she ends up way down by Jackson Lake. But look at the country she's covering. If you look at the elevational plot there, again, about 60 miles she's actually covering, getting up to heights of almost a little over 10,000 feet in elevation. I haven't even mentioned the rivers that these animals are crossing as well. During the time of year when the rivers are, you don't want to be crossing those rivers. We're going to see an example of an elk here in a second that she got to the river and said, "No, I don't think so." Just another image showing you the difficulties, and this comes from the North Fork, the difficulties of actually living as an animal migrating throughout the Absaroka Range. All right, let's move on to elk finally. Elk, we've got two different herds as well, kind of like the deer, Clark's Fork and Cody. And with these elk, we actually do population trend counts. So that means we go out, we count animals, we average that count with the previous 3 years to give us a total number. Within the Clark's Fork, there's a lot of variability, but currently we're a little bit below where we'd like to be. With the upper Shoshone, or I'm sorry, I should say Cody, we're currently a little bit above where we'd like to be. There's a lot of variability, a lot of things that play into this, and it has to do with some of the movement data that we've got. Annual survival is pretty good. With the study that we just started, about 85% survival. But what's amazing is that Arthur Middleton found in 2010 through 15 with his study is that if they could reach adult cow status, that their survival increased to almost 100%. So as they mature, they learn how to deal with the challenges out on the landscape. So this is by far the biggest data set that we have, a little over 1 million points at this juncture. And this doesn't even take into account the studies that happened where they were going out and tracking animals by hand. This is all just GPS data. And so we've got 180 individuals at this point, and that's the blobs is what it looks like. With elk, what you see is a lot more variability in their movement, and also being tied to a winter range or even being tied to migrate. We just published a paper recently showing that elk are less likely to migrate if the food's good. So they'll change. They will change. And you can see some of that in some of these movement patterns that we're seeing out here. And I'll show you one specifically here in just a minute. Again, expanding though. You see these longer routes. We see a lot more movement. We tend to see that elk are always on the move, and you can see that from the average number of miles that are traveled based on collar. So we almost doubled what we saw with our deer, and so within that time period, they're traveling a long way. They're looking for bigger food sources. They've got a bigger body. They've got to get up on these plateaus and move quite a bit. And so what I really wanted to focus on with elk is just these areas that are concentrated with elk movement. And this has really helped to drive another piece of management information, which is trail cameras. So you see here, this is Cabin Creek. This is Eagle Creek. Coming up here, this is Eagle Pass right here. And we see just a very tight movement of elk up in this area. Here's another one at Thoroughfare. Here's Pass Creek. And here's thoroughfare, and you can see that these animals are just jamming into this little spot right here. Here's another one coming off of Needle Creek and up over in Fall Creek here. I don't know how many of you are horse people or how many of you ever been up Fall Creek. Yeah, it's not really a trail. It's a horrible trail. I went up it once, and I don't know if I'll go back. But so they're traveling up that. They're making some pretty serious elevation change in a short period. Now, what I wanted to show you is the overlap with mule deer and elk. So in purple, we've got mule deer, and in the beige color, we've got the elk. And here's thoroughfare, and here's open creek right here. And so what you can see is that these animals are piling into that small of an area as they're migrating. So it's definitely not species specific. What that allows us to do, though, when we see these pinch points, is utilize it for better data collection. And so we've done that. Currently, I've got close to 40 trail cameras set up across the mountains at all these different locations. That allows me to get a better idea of number of animals coming through those areas each year and what the makeup of them is. These are cool areas because we get both mule deer and elk, and the same in a couple of these other spots where we're getting both species moving through, and actually sheep as well. Don't get too many goats in any of these spots though. So I wanted to show you, this is an elk that we collared just this last year in February. She stayed kind of down. This is the Meeteetse Rim country. Here's Carter Mountain. Meeteetse Rim's right back here. She lived there for the winter and then took off. Spent some time in Yellowstone. I think she came into some money because she moved down by Jackson. It's the only thing I can figure. I'm not really sure why she's down there. She wintered here. You never see this with mule deer. They never switch winter ranges. She was over here, got to talking to some other cows, and decided to go south. And so now she's living down there. These locations right here are as of about a week ago. So she's still down there. So it's pretty amazing that the elk can do that. And we've seen it in other studies. I've seen it down in bags. It's pretty amazing. And this is kind of the elevational gradient that she travels, 66 miles, 26,000 feet of elevation change. She goes through her migration, carrying a large calf in her stomach there. So one thing, let me back up. I forgot to point this out. Look at this little blib right here. This is the Yellowstone River. There's a little blib here. Why did she stop there? Those are the things that kind of come to my mind. And we go in and we plot these points. Here's the river, Yellowstone River. All these points are right at the beginning of June. Does anybody know what happens to elk at the beginning of June? They drop calves. So she got to the river and is like, I think I'm going to hang out here for a while. Either the river was really high or, in June, I can't even imagine trying to get across the Yellowstone. And so she ended up hanging out here for, I think it's about 9 days there that she hung out there and then went across. And I have every belief that she had a calf, and she made that calf swim the river. It's amazing. These animals are absolutely amazing. Here's another one. I just wanted to show you a weird movement that we had never seen before. Captured this elk over on Sheep Mountain. She went down, hung out at the fields, was a problem there, decided to come up, and she actually went across drainage and across Carter Mountain, came down, spent the rest of her winter down on Meeteetse Rim, almost out to 120 out here, and then took off and made the migration through Boulder Basin, up Fall, down Thoroughfare, and lived over kind of up behind our cabin there. I can't remember the name of that mountain there. Somebody else will. But anyway, she's living up in the park there, and so just an amazing movement there. One thing I wanted to point out, though, is with our elk, we have seen a switch from migratory to kind of more local movements. This is an elk that we collared on Meeteetse Rim, and she basically lived along the kind of southeast side of Carter Mountain. This is her entire movement. And we're seeing that. And it's something that really throws a wrench into management is when you have animals that are migrating and animals that are not. And what we also see with animals that are migrating, lower calf ratios. With animals that are not migrating, higher calf ratios. Now, how many of you have heard of brucellosis? Brucellosis is a big deal. And so with brucellosis, guess who's probably going to be getting in trouble? And guess who's growing calves and growing at a higher rate than the elk that are migrating? So these kind of things help us to determine what portion of the population that we see in the winter are not migrating, that are kind of living there, and helps us to also kind of form and fashion hunting seasons. So let me ask again, are they living the easy life? No. The thing that I want to instill today as I leave is that even though it seems like these animals are doing well on winter range, and there's plenty of them out there, you see them all the time, we've really got to do our part in their little part of their life cycle when they come down here. We've got to do our part to make sure that we're not creating more difficulties, that we're sharing that space in a way that allows them to not to have such a hard time while they're down here. And I just reference these things because they are a reality. When we look at fences, we look at roads, there's issues there. I would say on the South and North Fork, we take more does and fawns with vehicles than we ever would with a rifle. And so as we go out from here and think about the movement patterns of these animals, you know, we've really got to do our part to ensure that fences are safe, that we're slowing down on roads, that we're really watching for the wildlife out there. I want to thank you for your attention, and this is the end. Thank you.